Welcome to Never Rewrite. I'm Isaac Askew.
Dustin Ray.
And I'm Jeffrey Sherman. And today we're going to debate about whether the default advice should be to split your tech stack into more technologies as appropriate or consolidate technologies to have fewer pieces in your tech stack. And to kick it off, I've been thinking about this I'm working at a scale up or a startup that has left scale up and is now in a sort of steady state. And there's a lot of similar technologies that they're using that could be used either way. And I'm starting to think, oh, I should be pushing for tech consolidation, right? You shouldn't have SQS and Kafka that are doing more or less the same things in your tech stack. You should pick one and then migrate out the rest of the stuff there to it because then you support less. We also have like Memcache and Redis. So you don't really need both of those technologies. They're pretty similar. And so I thought we could go with, should you push towards that, or does it make sense sometimes to push for more technologies in the stack?
Okay.
So I can kind of kick it off, I guess. I kind of even just like rolling with the Kafka SQS example, and going straight into like my first question. If I think from not the engineering perspective, but if you come to me as like I'm the CEO of the company, even imagining I don't have my technical knowledge, like how do I evaluate a decision like this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And let's say and I think we're assuming at this point for whatever reason through POCs that became production or this or that, or this developer wanted this and this developer wanted this, we now have Kafka and SQS in production doing things in service that we are making money from. My immediate question is going to be, what is the business value of the consolidation? Not from the perspective of only just what is the value, but why is it valuable right now versus this other thing I'm thinking of investing engineering time for. That would be how I would start to evaluate it. Because there may be valid reasons, right? So, for example, in the Kafka and SQS example, if you were to consolidate in half your cost and get the same like profit margin, like right, like you're getting more profit for half of the cost, then that may be worth the investment, especially when you're thinking about how much time will that compound.
Mm-hmm.
But if consolidating is simply like a convenience for the engineers and it doesn't actually accelerate development or the product roadmap, then I think it just becomes like a money pit, right? Like there's no actual customer value. That's it's kind of behind the scenes stuff.
Correct. In these examples, I don't think there'd be any customer value. Theoretically, there wouldn't be customer impact.
Yeah.
Right.
The the pieces that I see as meaningful that it would change is it makes your developers more fungible. If you've got Kafka and SQS,
Mm-hmm.
then some of your developers are going to be very familiar with Kafka and all the intricacies because it's a true pub sub. And if you're using SNS SQS, it's a lighter model. It does less things. It's less robust, but it's easier.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have some developers trained on one and some developers trained on the other, then they become less fungible and harder to move around.
Right. So there
I
becomes
don't
like
think
a
there'd be
difficulty with talent density in that situation.
right. I don't think there'd be any real cost savings. I'm sure there's marginal
Right.
cost savings or incremental costs, but I don't think there'd be. So I'm saying in this question, I don't think there's any customer value specifically, and I don't think there's any cost savings or expenses to be had. I think it's more a question of a pure developer fungibility, right? Especially when there's incidents. If
Sure.
if half of your developers know one stack and the other half know the other, and it's 3 a.m., you have to think about which ones you could call.
Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
is it doubling your maintenance overhead is what I'm thinking
Yeah.
of, right? Like,
Yeah,
do you now have to have essentially two people on call to support both systems where you could have gotten away with one?
right.
So I
Yeah.
think, yeah, those are the trade-offs I'm looking at in that situation.
I think yeah. When it comes to like the idea of like, do I do something or nothing? Like, do I need to actually consolidate these services? I would want to reflect on those incidents that did happen, right? If no incidents happened, then maybe not. If incidents did happen and there was like an actual cost, you can say, okay, well, because of this downtime, because these lack of resources, the engineers not available, lack of understanding between these two products, or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
that we lost X amount of money and we can't have that happen again. And so it will take
Right.
X amount to fix it. You just weigh the kind of cost benefit there, and that
Yeah.
becomes part of your argument.
Yeah. I think there is a point though, like looking back in my own consulting of, what's the counter example to that? I can definitely think of counter examples, like several, and it's probably in the features where it's a more complex feature, but it's
Hmm.
it's almost like a requirement to have it. And I'll kind of get where I'm going with this. But it's not the center of the business. It's not like this particular feature is the innovation of the business. It's just a cost of doing business. Something that comes to mind is like search, especially if you're moving from that like startup to scale up
Mm-hmm.
phase. Like that's where you may have had a fake search like working, and then suddenly search doesn't work one day, and it's like, well, why doesn't search work one day? It's like, well, the query got too big, and now you have like to do search. So like, what do you do? Do you buy? Do you build? And I think at that point it becomes like, I think it does make sense to potentially outsource some of that work to like a search service or whatever, because it's not
Hmm.
actually core to the business. If you're building a CRM, the customer search through your CRM is obviously crucial to the functionality, but it's not like that's the thing that brings your customer in. Right? That's not the
Right. It's
innovation.
table stakes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So those are the cases I think of where I would recommend bringing in technology in order to save engineering resources as an investment, because those
Yeah.
are things you're going to churn on constantly too. This like things like search and stuff like that.
Right. Searches would always be. It's never going to be done. It's always something that could be
Right.
improved. So if you could pay somebody else to always work on it, that would make a lot of sense. Um, how about something more? So in my mind, if you had MySQL and Postgres saying, "Hey, we want to consolidate to one or the other," not they're very similar technologies. They're not drop-in replacements, but if you just said, "Hey, we want to use one just to reduce the maintenance cost and to improve developer overhead," fine. But if somebody said, "Hey, we're doing Ruby," and this other group's like, "No, no, we want to do Go or Python or something," flavor of the week, those are much harder lifts to
Mm-hmm.
consolidate. So how do you feel like, does it make sense to, or when would it make sense to push for a consolidation of the languages, or
Yeah,
does it
I
never?
I think I have gone back and forth with this over the years. There was a point in time where I think a lot of us were enamored with the idea of like microservice teams that can kind of choose
Mm-hmm.
their own stack and fully own it. They can choose what DB that they use and all of that. But my personal opinion is that that's from an organizational standpoint. Like if I am thinking from, I'm the organization, right?
Mm-hmm.
The organization is much more efficient, um, and has more kind of economies of scale, especially at the team of teams level, if
Mm-hmm.
all of the technology is as kind of homogenous as possible across the
Mm-hmm.
unit. Because essentially it's almost like hive mind. Like it's like the base level of knowledge becomes so high because there's just such a fundamental understanding across the org that even newcomers coming in quickly absorb and upskill to now what is the minimum level of like this technology. And I think it's a lot more effective, even as an engineer and like a human being, to hold in memory how one, two, three, four technologies work versus how does Python respond in this environment versus PHP versus TypeScript versus Java, and having to manage all of that as an
Mm-hmm.
organization is like you're paying all of those maintenance overheads over and over again. So like even as a single team unit, if our team wants to do that, in my opinion, that's still the team acting out of its own best interest more than the
Mm.
organization's best interest. So, like, even as a team, you have to see yourself as part of the bigger team of teams. That's my
That's a
opinion.
good call out. The team self interest versus the organization self interest.
Yeah.
I think there's a funny rewrite kind of concept here as well, because if you have two different technologies and you're trying to consolidate, you essentially have to rewrite what's in Ruby and Python or whatever. At that point, then you go back to the same territory we've been talking about forever, which is like you have to have some kind of forcing function, like the deprecation of some kind of software doesn't get patch updates anymore, something that makes it worthwhile. Otherwise, just let it be. And there needs to be something that to justify throwing that money to moving to porting that software that
Right.
I can't maintain this anymore for whatever reason.
Right, because as we said, there's no inherent customer value in this work.
Right.
Yeah, and just for the sake
it's
of,
more like an
I
investment.
mean, yeah, as I know, this is probably an instinct of everybody, on this call, that whenever we see a bunch of things that could just be made simpler, remove tech stack or just clean it up, that's what we want to do inherently, because it's like, oh, this is just the right way to engineer something, or this is just the right way, standard or practice, but that right way to do it, if it's just scratching our own itch, and it's burning developer hours, that's doing the same thing with like our self-interest versus the organizations. Like, imagine me going through and just cleaning up something that's bugging me, and it takes me 40 hours to clean it up, and nobody asked me to do that, and it didn't provide any customer value, and it just made me feel better about my environment. That's pretty selfish.
You better
right?
be ready to explain how that's going to make everyone faster in the long run.
Right.
Yeah, you better sell that pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As someone who's done that. But to Dustin's thing, like this week, I was Googling the object pointer inherit. I wasn't sure how arrays are passed in PHP. And I was like, are they copy? Are they reference? I'm like, I have no idea. I don't even remember anymore any language about how arrays are passed and whether I need to make a deep copy or if it's automatically done or anything. So I just Googled it. But like I had to stop and think about it of, oh, I've got an array. It's an object. This could be different. I don't remember how this works in this language.
Right. And so
It's
extrapolate
copies,
that
by the
times
way, if you're
100,
interested.
100 or 1,000 engineers, right?
Yeah.
It's like, even if it's 15 minutes a day, like you're talking about massive, at scale, you don't want to think about it, but that's kind of the thing. And it's like flow, right? Like the other thing I think about a lot is, like as an engineer, it's not always so, in my mind at least, it's not always so cut and dry. Like some of engineering is like almost pain tolerance. Like how much frustration can you bear through to like get your project done? And I think removing as much of that kind of psychological and emotional load from your engineers can actually, improve efficiency. I don't have the numbers on it, but I always imagine that, even with housework, it's like the most efficient and easy you can make it, the easier it is to get done. It doesn't necessarily mean it got done faster, but it maybe got done in a more complete way. So I think there is something to be said there too. If like, how do you quantify those, kind of under the hood benefits?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like tech debt where it's really hard to
Right.
sell it sometimes. Like you really have to show that the compounding interest, so to speak, is actually starting to impact you in these ways or slow you down in these ways. And if you can't sell that, then no one's really going to approve it.
Right.
Your work done.
Yeah.
So, should you push to consolidate technology? It depends.
It depends.
It depends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's always what. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, one last thought there I had was like in the Jonathan Stark episode that we're talking about. At one point, it might be reasonable just to pay somebody, like a non-developer, just to keep clicking a button and cleaning things up manually, because
Yep.
that actually might be more cost efficient than the re-architecting something or actually fixing a broken problem. It could actually be okay to do things in a really crappy way that feels awful for engineers, but actually just makes more sense. And so the same thing here with if you have somebody else working on another tech stack, then you're trying to consolidate it, and it might just be better just to have one or two people just keep poking updates at it and maintaining it rather than go, oh, I have to delete that and just rebuild it in this other system just to consolidate for the sake of whatever reason.
Right. Totally true. And I hate it, but it's true.
Yeah. It sucks.
Yeah, engineers have a trouble with anything where they notice inefficiency, and I think
Yeah.
that's the difference with that's like the dichotomy with engineering and business sometimes, right? Like engineering is all about
Hmm.
optimization, and the business side is about leverage. So it's like if we have to lose and shed some of this in order to gain this leverage, we have to do it. And I think as an engineer, that kind of change in thinking is what eventually got me more excited and thinking more in business context.
Yeah.
Because if
Same.
you
Hmm.
change your engineering mind from optimization to how do I create leverage as like what am I optimizing for, then it's almost like it's easier to kind of predict what you think that the business will want, because that's probably how they're thinking. They're not thinking about squeezing the most out of it. They're thinking, how do I double the orchard? How do I double the thing that we're doing? And
Yeah.
that's going to have some waste naturally. So just food for thought.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you all for listening. I'm Jeffrey Sherman.
Dustin Ray.
And I'm Isaac Askew, and this is Never Rewrite.